Hi, third graders. So to start off, I am going to be reading one chapter from this book. It's called Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Satcher. I think that's how you say his last name. And I'm going to be reading a chapter every day. Now, the reason I love this book is that it's all about one school, which is an extremely tall school, but the stories don't necessarily all go together. Each story is about a different level from the school. So the first story that I'm going to read to you is about the 30th floor on this school. I'm also going to read the introduction to let you guys get to know this a little bit better. So again, this is called Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It is level 38, which is right along where you should be with your reading level for a third grader. All right, so let's begin. Here's the introduction to kind of give you a better idea of what this story is all about. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it is 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to the class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That is probably also true. It is true. We are very strange and very silly. Here's the first chapter, and it's all about the teacher, Mrs. Gorf. Hopefully I don't remind you of her in any sort of way. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. A story is kind of like a level in this case. So there's the first level of a building, second level, third. She's on the 30th level, which is the highest level in the whole school. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Oh, I lost my train of thought. There we are. Does anybody else have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in the classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. Goodness. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "Bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Oh my goodness, just for saying bless you. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Maurizia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Maurizia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Maurizia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. So just like we have three Zainabs, they have three Erics. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. A dozen is 12. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Maurizia, and the three Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Those are funny names. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. Oh, come on. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. Remember, Todd is an apple, so an apple is yelling at her. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Maurizia, let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Lewis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many apples on her desk. Picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf. Shined it on his shirt and ate it. Oh my goodness. So that was the end of that chapter and kind of the end of the story of Mrs. Gorf and her apples. So here are my questions for you that I want you to leave in the comments. The first question is that, what do you think Mrs. Kaltz would turn you into if I didn't like what you were doing? Mrs. Gorf chose apples because she loves apples. What do you think I would turn you into if you were messing around? And also, what do you think would make me turn you into something else? What do you think would really bother me enough to change you into something else? So leave those answers in the comments and come back tomorrow. And I'm going to read the next chapter called Mrs. Jules, who looks to be teaching a bunch of monkeys.